Although her family's wealth protected her from hardships faced by many other black children, Mary Church Terrell, early in life, experienced the painful sting of prejudice. As a young girl, she began to take the determined stand against racism, which lasted her whole life. At the age of 89, Mary Terrell led picket lines and legal action to desegregate restaurants and stores in Washington, D.C. She was a longtime fighter for equality, peace, and women's rights. The childhood of Mary Church Terrell.
During my childhood, my parents lived in what was then called the suburbs of Memphis, where I was born near the close of the Civil War. My grandmother was called Aunt Liza by everybody, black and white, old and young, and was generally beloved. She could tell the most thrilling stories imaginable, and I listened to her by the hour. Occasionally, grandmother told me tales of brutality perpetrated upon slaves who belonged to cruel masters. But they affected her and me so deeply, she was rarely able to finish what she began. I tried to keep the tears back and the sobs suppressed so that grandmother would carry it to the bitter end, but I seldom succeeded. Then she would stop abruptly and refuse to go on, promising to finish it another time. It nearly killed me to think that my dear grandmother, whom I loved so devotedly, had once been a slave. "Never mind, honey," she used to say to comfort me. "Grandma ain't a slave no more." She had an unpleasant experience herself, which it pained me to hear her relate. She was reared in the house and was the housekeeper for old Miss, so she rarely came into contact with the overseer. But one day she went into the field on an errand, and the overseer challenged her about something. She resented what he said, and he threatened to whip her. "I dared him to touch me," she said. Then he started toward me, raising his whip. I took out and run just as fast as ever I could, and he's right behind me. When I got to the kitchen door, I picked up a chair and I said, "If you come a step nearer, I'll knock your brains out with this here chair." And he never come a step nearer neither. The first time I remember having the race problem brought directly home to me was when I was going north with my father, who used to take me with him everywhere he went. I couldn't have been more than 5 years old. There was no Jim Crow car law in the state of Tennessee then, so that although there was a separate coach for colored people, and they were expected to occupy it, there was no law on the statute books to force them to sit in it. As a rule, therefore, self-respecting colored people would not go into the coach set apart for them. When my father boarded the train, he took me into the best coach, but soon afterward went into the smoker. My father had been in the smoker but a short time when the conductor passed through the coach to collect tickets. He glared at me and asked me who I was and what I was doing in that car. I replied as well as a frightened little girl 5 years old could be expected to answer under the circumstances. But I did not placate the irate conductor, who decided then and there to put me into the coach where I belonged. As he pulled me roughly out of the seat, he turned to the man sitting across the aisle and said, "Whose little nigger is this?" The man told him who my father was and advised him to let me alone. Seeing the conductor was about to remove me from the car, one of my father's white friends went into the smoker to tell him what was happening. My father returned immediately, and there ensued a scene which no one who saw it could ever forget. In that section at the time, it was customary for men to carry revolvers in their pockets. Fortunately, no one was injured, and I was allowed to remain with my courageous father in the white coach. Naturally, this incident agitated my young mind considerably. I plied my father with questions. I thought of all the sins of omission and commission against which my mother had warned me before I left home, but I could think of nothing that I had done wrong. I got no satisfaction from father, for he refused to talk about the incident and forbade me to do so. In relating the incident to my mother when I reached home, I asked her why the conductor had wanted to take me out of a nice, clean coach and put me into one my father said was dirty. I assured her I had been careful to do everything she told me to do. I hadn't lost either of the 2 pieces of blue ribbon which tied the little braids on each side of my head. I hadn't soiled my dress a single bit. I was sitting up straight and proper. Neither was I looking out of the window, resting on my knees with my feet on the seat, which I so dearly loved to do. I wasn't talking loud. In short, I assured my mother I was behaving like a little lady. Trying to suppress her tears, my mother patted me on the head and comforted me by saying she was sure I was behaving myself. But she explained the incident by telling me that sometimes conductors on railroad trains were unkind and treated good little girls very badly. Seeing their children touched and seared and wounded by race prejudice is one of the heaviest crosses which colored women have to bear. Realizing that the educational facilities for colored children were very poor in Memphis at the time, and that she could not rear me as she wished, Mother decided to send me north to school when I was about 6 years old. 2 of her friends had sent their daughters to the model school at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and she decided to send me there also. Mother took me there herself and arranged to have me board with a family by the name of Hunster. No little girl could possibly have been happier than I was so far away from home, for I became a member of that family in every sense of the word. I called Mrs. Hunster Ma and Mr. Hunster Pa. After I had attended the model school for several years, the Hunsters advised my mother to send me to the public schools. In the public schools of Yellow Springs, while we were reciting our history lesson one day, it suddenly occurred to me that I myself was descended from the very slaves whom the Emancipation Proclamation set free. I was stunned. I felt humiliated and disgraced. When I had read or heard about the Union armies and the rebel forces, I had never thought about my connection with slavery at all. But now I knew I belonged to a group of people who had been brutalized, degraded, and sold like animals. This was a rude and terrible shock indeed. "Here you are," said a voice ironically, "measuring arms with these white children whose ancestors have always been free. What audacity!" I was covered with confusion and shame at the thought, and my humiliation was painful indeed. When I recovered my composure, I resolved that so far as this descendant of slaves was concerned, she would show those white girls and boys that she was their equal in every respect. At that time, I was the only colored girl in the class, and I felt I must hold high the banner of my race. It was at Yellow Springs that I was obliged to make my first decision with reference to the race problem. A play was to be produced at the close of the public schools, and the pupils were being selected for their parts. It was an amusing little play in which several nationalities were to appear. I was invited to take the part of a Negro servant who made a monkey of himself and murdered the king's English. But I refused to do so, without discussing the matter with anyone at home or asking anyone's advice. I decided not to take the part. I knew this role was being assigned to me solely because I was a colored girl, and I was embarrassed and hurt. Before this, while I was attending the model school, I had an experience which indelibly impressed my racial identity upon me, and about which even to this day I do not like to think. Every noon, I went into the cloakroom to get my wraps, preparatory to going home. One day when I entered, a group of young women were chattering, and several of them were posing before the mirror, joking about their charms. "Behold my lovely tresses," one was saying. "But look at my sparkling eyes," challenged another. "My rosebud mouth," called out a third, "is the admiration of the world." After putting on my coat, I heard someone speak to me as I passed the mirror, and not knowing what else to say, I imitated the young ladies as a small girl sometimes will, by asking, "Haven't I got a pretty face too?" "You've got a pretty black face," said one of the young ladies, pointing her finger at me derisively. The shout of laughter that went up from that group of young women rings in my ears to this day. For the first time in my life, I realized I was an object of ridicule on account of the color of my skin. I was so shocked, embarrassed, and hurt, I was glued to the spot and could not budge an inch. I seemed to lose the power to think as well as to move, so I could not say a word. It dawned on me with terrific force that these young white girls were making fun of me, were laughing at me because I was colored. As I stood motionless, a pathetic little figure in that large room, the laughter died down considerably. I had not yet put on my hat, and it slipped to the floor. When I had recovered sufficiently to stoop and pick it up, the change of position seemed to restore my power to think and to revive my courage. I ran to the door, stopped, turned around, and hurled back defiantly. I don't want my face to be white like yours and look like milk. I want it nice and dark, just like it is. As I ran down the hall, I heard them clapping their hands. Born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, in 1868, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois had lived almost a century when he died in Accra, Ghana, in 1963. A distinguished graduate of Fisk, Harvard, and Berlin universities, he became a social scientist, political organizer, editor, lecturer, novelist, poet, and world traveler. Dr. Du Bois devoted his long life to the fight against racism, colonialism, illiteracy, poverty, and war. Here, Dr. Du Bois describes his famous early conflict with Booker T. Washington, the founding of the Niagara Movement, and the beginning of his work for the new NAACP.
Since the controversy between myself and Booker T. Washington has become historic, it deserves more careful statement than it has had hitherto. There was, first of all, the ideological controversy. I believed in the higher education of a talented tenth, who through their knowledge of modern culture could guide the American Negro into higher civilization. I knew that without this, the Negro would have to accept the white leadership, and that such leadership could not always be trusted to guide this group into self-realization and to its highest cultural possibilities. Now, Mr. Washington, on the other hand, believed that the Negro as an efficient worker could gain wealth, and that eventually, through his ownership of capital, he would be able to achieve a recognized place in American culture, and could then educate his children as he might wish. For this reason, he proposed to put the emphasis at present upon training in the skilled trades and encouragement in industry and common labor. These two theories of Negro progress were not absolutely contradictory. I recognized the importance of the Negro gaining a foothold in trades and his encouragement in industry and common labor. Mr. Washington was not absolutely opposed to college training, but he did minimize its importance. But beyond this difference of ideal lay another and more bitter and insistent controversy. This started with the rise of Tuskegee Institute and, centering around Booker T. Washington, of what I may call the Tuskegee machine. The years from 1899 to 1905 marked the culmination of the career of Booker T. Washington. He became, during the administrations of Theodore Roosevelt and William Taft, from 1901 to 1912, the political referee in all federal appointments or action taken with reference to the Negro, and in many regarding the white South. In 1903, Andrew Carnegie made the future of Tuskegee certain by a gift of $600,000. There was no question of Booker T. Washington's undisputed leadership of the 10 million Negroes in America, a leadership recognized gladly by the whites and conceded by most of the Negroes. But there were discrepancies and paradoxes in this leadership. It did not seem fair, for instance, that on the one hand, Mr. Washington should decry political activities among Negroes, and on the other hand, dictate Negro political objectives from Tuskegee. At a time when Negro civil rights called for organized and aggressive defense, he broke down that defense by advising acquiescence, or at least no open agitation. During the period between 1890 and 1909, when laws disfranchising the Negro were being passed in all the southern states, and when these were being supplemented by, quote, Jim Crow, unquote, travel laws and other enactments making color caste legal, Washington's public speeches, while they did not entirely ignore this development, tended continually to excuse it, to emphasize the shortcomings of the Negro, and were interpreted widely as putting the chief onus for his condition upon the Negro himself. Not only did presidents of the United States consult Booker T. Washington, but governors and congressmen, philanthropists conferred with him, scholars wrote to him. Tuskegee became a vast information bureau and center of advice. It was not merely passive in these matters, but active efforts were made to concentrate influence at Tuskegee. After a time, almost no Negro institution could collect funds without the recommendation or acquiescence of Mr. Washington. Even the careers of rising young colored men were very often determined by his advice, and certainly his opposition was fatal. Moreover, it must not be forgotten that this Tuskegee machine was not solely the idea and activity of black folk at Tuskegee. It was largely encouraged and given financial aid through certain white groups and individuals in the North. Now, this northern group had clear objectives. They were capitalists and employers, and yet in most cases, sons, relatives, or friends of the abolitionists who had sent teachers into the new Negro South after the Civil War. These younger men believed that the Negro problem could not remain a matter of philanthropy. It must be a matter of business. These Negroes were not to be encouraged as voters in the new democracy, nor were they to be left at the mercy of the reactionary South. They were good laborers, and they might be better. They could become a strong labor force, and properly guided, they would restrain the unbridled demands of white labor, born of northern labor unions and now spreading to the South. To this school of thought, the philosophy of Booker Washington came as a godsend, and it proposed, by building up his prestige and power, to control the Negro group. The control was to be drastic. The Negro intelligentsia was to be suppressed and hammered into conformity. This was the real force back of the Tuskegee machine. It had money and it had opportunity, and it found in Tuskegee tools to do its bidding. All this naturally aroused increasing opposition among Negroes, and especially among the younger classes of educated Negroes, who were beginning to emerge here and there, especially from northern institutions. This opposition began to become vocal in 1901, when two men, Monroe Trotter and George Forbes, began the publication of the Boston Guardian. The Guardian was bitter, satirical, and personal, but it was well edited. It was earnest, and it published facts. It attracted wide attention among colored people. And when the Guardian began to increase in influence, determined effort was made to build up a Negro press for Tuskegee. Negro newspapers were influenced, and finally the oldest and largest was bought by white friends of Tuskegee. Most of the other papers found it to their advantage, certainly not to oppose Mr. Washington, even if they did not wholly agree with him. Negroes who sought high positions groveled for his favor. I was greatly disturbed at this time, not because I was in absolute opposition to the things Mr. Washington was advocating, but because I was strongly in favor of more open agitation against wrongs, and above all, I resented the practical buying up of the Negro press and choking off of even mild and reasonable opposition to Mr. Washington. I was increasingly uncomfortable under the statements of Mr. Washington's position, and above all, I resented the Tuskegee machine. I had been asked some time before by a publisher if I did not have some essays that they might put together and issue immediately. I got together a number of my fugitive pieces. I then added a chapter, quote, of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others, unquote, in which I sought to make a frank evaluation. The Souls of Black Folk was published in 1903. Then came a new and surprising turn to the whole situation, which in the end quite changed my life. In the early summer of 1905, Mr. Washington went to Boston and arranged to speak in a colored church to colored people a thing which he did not often do in the North. Trotter and Forbes, editors of The Guardian, determined to heckle him and make him answer publicly certain questions with regard to his attitude toward voting and education. The result was a disturbance magnified by the newspapers into a riot, which resulted in the arrest of Mr. Trotter. When Trotter went to jail, my indignation overflowed. I did not always agree with Mr. Trotter then or later, but he was an honest, brilliant, unselfish man, and to treat as a crime that which was at worst mistaken judgment was an outrage. I sent out from Atlanta in June 1905 a call to a few selected persons for organized determination and aggressive action on the part of men who believe in Negro freedom and growth. I proposed a conference during the summer to oppose firmly present methods of strangling honest criticism, to organize intelligent and honest Negroes, and to support organs of news and public opinion. 59 colored men from 17 different states signed a call for a meeting near Buffalo, New York, during the week of July 9, 1905. I went to Buffalo and hired a little hotel on the Canada side of the river at Fort Erie, and waited for the men to attend the meeting. If sufficient men had not come to pay for the hotel, I should certainly have been in bankruptcy and perhaps in jail. But as a matter of fact, 29 men representing 14 states came. The Niagara Movement was organized January the 31st, 1906. Later that year, instead of meeting in secret, we met openly at Harper's Ferry, the scene of John Brown's raid, and had in significance, if not in numbers, one of the greatest meetings that American Negroes have ever held. My career as a scientist was to be swallowed up in my role as a master of propaganda. This was not wholly to my liking. I was not a natural leader of men. I could not easily break down an inherited reserve, or at all times curb a biting, critical tongue. Nevertheless, having put my hand to the plow, I had to go on. The Niagara Movement, with less momentum, met in Boston in 1907 and in Oberlin in 1908. Finally, it practically became merged with a new and enveloping organization. This started with the lynching, 100 years after the birth of Abraham Lincoln in his birthplace. A group of liberals formed a committee in New York, which I was invited to join. A conference was held in 1909. After the conference, a new organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was formed, which without formal merger absorbed practically the whole membership of the Niagara Movement, save Trotter, who distrusted our white allies and their objects. With some hesitation, I was asked to come as Director of Publications and Research. Here was an opportunity to enter the lists in a desperate fight aimed straight at the real difficulty, the question as to how far educated Negro opinion in the United States was going to have the right and opportunity to guide the Negro group. I did not hesitate because I could not. It was the voice without reply, and I went to New York.
After escaping from slavery, Josiah Henson educated himself, founded a Canadian colony for fugitive slaves, was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, became a well-known anti-slavery speaker, and wrote the story of his life. Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous fictional character, Uncle Tom, was based partially on Josiah Henson's early life. Henson's narrative of his later life shows that he became quite the opposite of the submissive, unresisting Uncle Tom. Josiah Henson, conducting slaves to Canada.
After I had tasted the blessings of freedom, my mind reverted to those who I knew were groaning in captivity. And I at once proceeded to take measures to free as many as I could. I had promised to assist in restoring to liberty the friends of James Lightfoot. In pursuance of this promise, I left my own family in the hands of no other save God and commenced a journey alone on foot and traveled thus about 400 miles into the slave state of Kentucky. On arriving at Portsmouth in the state of Ohio, I had a narrow escape from being detected. I was obliged to resort to a stratagem in order to avoid being questioned by the Kentuckians I saw in the place. To this end, I procured some dried leaves, put them in a cloth, and bound it all around my face, reaching nearly to my eyes, and pretended to be so seriously affected in my head and teeth as not to be able to speak. During my short stay in Portsmouth, I was accosted by several who appeared very anxious to get some particulars from me as to who I was and where I was going and to whom I belonged. To all their numerous inquiries, I merely shook my head, mumbled out indistinct answers, and acted so that they could not get anything out of me. I passed through the free states, so-called, crossed the Ohio River into Kentucky, and ultimately found the friends of James Lightfoot in the place he had described. I was an entire stranger to them, but I took with me a small token of their brother who was gone, which they had once recognized. This was to let him know that he had gone to Canada, the land of freedom, and had now sent a friend to assist them in making their escape. The following Saturday night was named to put it into execution. During the interval, I had to keep myself concealed by day and used to meet him by night to make the necessary arrangements. For fear of being detected, they started off without bidding their father or mother farewell. In order to prevent the hounds from following on our trail, we seized a skiff and made our way down the river. A boat sprang a leak before we got halfway to Cincinnati, and we narrowly escaped being drowned. Providentially, however, we got to shore before the boat sunk. Well, this was an anxious time. When we got within 7 miles of Cincinnati, we came to the Miami River. We could not reach the city without crossing it. This was a great barrier to us, for the water appeared to be deep. We were afraid to ask the loan of a boat, being apprehensive it might lead to our detection. We went first up and then down the river, trying to find a convenient crossing place, but failed. I then said to my company, "Hey, boys, let's go up the river and try again." After going about a mile, we saw a cow coming out of a wood and going to the river as though she intended to drink. Then said I, "Hey, boys, let's go and see what that cow is about. Maybe that she will tell us some news." I said this in order to cheer him up, and one of them replied in a rather peevish way, "Oh, that cow can't talk." But I again urged him to come on. Cow remained until we approached. She then walked into the river and went straight across without swimming, which caused me to remark, "The Lord sent that cow to show us where to cross the river." Well, this has always seemed to me to be a very wonderful event. Having urged our way with considerable haste, we were literally saturated with perspiration, though it was snowing at the time. My companions thought it be highly dangerous for us to proceed through the water, especially there was a large quantity of ice in the river. But as it was a question of life or death with us, there was no time left for reasoning. I therefore advanced, they reluctantly following. The youngest of the Lightfoots, ere we had reached midway of the river, was seized with violent contraction of the limbs, which prevented further self-exertion on his part. He was therefore carried the remainder of the distance. The boy was taken alarmingly ill, and we were compelled to proceed with him on our backs. But finding this mode of conveying him exceedingly irksome, we constructed a kind of litter with our shirts and handkerchiefs laid across poles. Our patient continued to get worse, and it appeared both to himself and to us all that death would soon release him from his sufferings. He therefore begged to be left in some secluded spot to die alone, as he feared that the delay occasioned by his having to be carried through the bush might lead to the capture of the whole company. With very considerable reluctance, we acceded to his request and laid him in a sheltered place. Sad indeed was the parting. It was with difficulty we tore ourselves away. We had not, however, proceeded more than 2 miles on our journey when one of the brothers of the dying man made a sudden stop and expressed his inability to proceed whilst he had the consciousness that he had left his brother to perish. His grief was so great that we determined to return, and at length reached the spot where we found the poor fellow moaning out with every breath a prayer to heaven. We at once prepared to resume our journey as best we could. After making some progress, we saw at a little distance on the road a wagon approaching, and I immediately determined to ascertain whether some assistance could not be obtained. When I came up with the driver, I bade him good day. He said, "Where's thee going?" "To Canada." I saw his coat, heard his thee and thou, and set him down for a Quaker. I therefore plainly told him our circumstances. He at once stopped his horses and expressed his willingness to assist us. So I returned to the place where my companions were waiting for me, and soon had them in the presence of the Quaker. Immediately on viewing the sufferer, he was moved to tears, and without delay turned his horses' heads to proceed in the direction of his home, although he had intended to go to a distant market with a load of produce for sale. The reception we met from the Quaker's family overjoyed our hearts. We remained with this happy family for the night and received from them every kindness. It was arranged that the boy should remain behind until, through the blessing of God, he should recover. We were kindly provided by them with a sack of biscuit and a joint of meat, and once more set our faces in the direction of Lake Erie. After proceeding some distance on the road, we perceived a white man approaching, but as he was traveling alone and on foot, we were not alarmed at his presence. It turned out that he had been residing for some time in the South. His employers had attempted to castigate him, in return for which he had used violence, which made it necessary that he should at once escape. Well, we traveled in his company and found that his presence was of signal service to us in delivering us out of the hands of the slave hunters who were now on our track and eagerly grasping after their prey. Just as the day was breaking, we reached a wayside tavern, immediately contiguous to the lake. Whilst our breakfast was in the course of preparation, we dozed off into slumber, wearied with our long-continued exertion. Whilst half asleep and half awake, an impression came forcibly upon me that danger was nigh, and that I must at once leave the house. I immediately urged my companions to follow me out, which they were exceedingly unwilling to do. But as they had promised me submission, they at length yielded to my request. We retired to the yard at the side of the house and commenced washing ourselves with the snow, which was now up to our knees. Presently we heard the tramping of horses and were at once warned of the necessity of secreting ourselves. We crept beneath a pile of bushes which were lying close at hand, which permitted the full view of the road. The horsemen came to a dead stop at the door of the house and commenced their inquiries. My companions at once recognized the porters on horseback and whispered their names to me. But this was a critical moment, and the loud beatings of their hearts testified the dreadful alarm with which they viewed the scene. Had we been within doors, we should have been inevitably sacrificed. Our white friend proceeded to the door in advance of the landlord and maintained his position. He was at once interrogated by the slave hunters whether he had seen any Negroes pass that way. And he said yes, he thought he had. Their number was demanded, and they were told about 6, and that they were proceeding in the direction of Detroit, and that they might be some few miles on the road. They at once reined their horses, which were greatly fatigued, though having been ridden all night, and were soon out of sight. We at length ventured into the house and devoured breakfast in an incredibly short space of time. After what had transpired, the landlord became acquainted with our circumstances, and at once offered to sail us in his boat across to Canada. Yeah, we were happy enough to have such an offer, and soon the white sail of our little bark was laying to the wind, with the land of liberty in full view. Words cannot describe the feelings experienced by my companions as they neared the shore. Their bosoms were swelling with inexpressible joy as they mounted the seats of the boat, ready, eagerly, to spring forward, that they might touch the soil of the freemen. And when they reached the shore, they danced and wept for joy and kissed the earth on which they first stepped, no longer the slave, but free. After the lapse of a few months, on one joyous Sabbath morning, I had the happiness of clasping the poor boy we had left in the kind care of the Quaker, no longer attenuated in frame, but robust and healthy, and surrounded by his family. Thus my joy was consummated. It is one of the greatest sources of my happiness to know that by similar means to those above narrated, I have been instrumental in delivering 118 human beings out of the cruel and merciless grasp of the slaveholder.
In 1851, at Christiana, Pennsylvania, a fugitive slave named William Parker led a group of angry black men to prevent any of their brethren being taken back to slavery. The event was called the Christiana Riot. Here Parker describes his early life and some exploits of his Pennsylvania self-defense organization. William Parker, The Freedman's Story.
I was born in Anne Arundel County, in the state of Maryland, on a plantation. My mother died when I was very young. Like every southern plantation of respectable extent, our place had what it called the quarter, or a place where the slaves of both sexes are lodged and fed. With us, the quarter was composed of a number of low buildings, with an additional building for single people and such of the children as were either orphans or had parents sold away. This building had a large fireplace at either end, and small rooms arranged along the sides. In these rooms, the children were huddled from day to day, the smaller and weaker, subject to the whims and caprices of the larger and stronger. The largest children would always seize upon the warmest and best places and say to us who were smaller, "Stand back, little chap, out of the way." And we had to stand back or get a thrashing. When my grandmother, who was cook at the great house, came to look after me, she always brought me a morsel privately, and at such times I was entirely free from annoyance by the older ones. But as she could visit me only once in 24 hours, my juvenile days enjoyed but little rest from my domineering superiors in years and strength. When my grandmother would inquire of the others how her little boy was getting on, they would tell her that I was doing well, and kindly invite me to the fire to warm myself. But I was afraid to complain to her of their treatment, as for so doing, they would have beaten me after she had gone to the great house again. I was thus compelled to submit to their misrepresentation as well as to their abuse and indifference till I grew older, when by fighting, first with one and then with another, I became too many for them and could have a seat at the fire as well as the best. This experience of my boyhood has since been repeated in my manhood. My rights at the fireplace were won by my child fists. My rights as a free man were, under God, secured by my own right arm. One morning, word was brought to the quarter that we should not work that day, but go up to the great house. As we were obeying the summons, a number of strange white men rode up to the mansion. They were Negro traders. Taking alarm, I ran away to the woods with a boy about my own age, named Levi Storax, and there we remained until the selections for the sale were made and the traders drove away. It was a serious time while they remained. Men, women, and children, all but crying, and general confusion prevailed. Without a word of warning, and for no fault of their own, parents and children, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters were separated to meet no more on earth. Levi and I climbed a pine tree when we got to the woods, and had this conversation together. Lee, I said to him, our turn will come next. Let's run away and not be sold like the rest. If we can only get clear this time, replied Lee, maybe they won't sell us. I will go to Master William and ask him not to do it. What will you get by going to Master William, I asked him. But if we see him and ask him not to sell us, he will do as he pleases. For my part, I think the best thing is to run away to the Free States. But, Levi replied, see how many start for the Free States and are brought back and are sold away down south. We could not be safe this side of Canada, and we should freeze to death before we got there. So ended our conversation. I must have been about 10 or 11 years old then. Yet young as I was, I heard of Canada as the land far away in the north, where the runaway was safe from pursuit. But to my imagination, it was a vast and cheerless waste of ice and snow. Levi's remarks were a damper upon our flight for the time being. When night came, Levi wanted to go home and see if they had sold his mother, but I did not care about going back, as I had no mother to sell. How desolate I was. No home, no protector, no mother, no attachments. As we turned our faces toward the quarter, I felt myself to be what I really was, a poor, friendless slave boy. Levi was equally sad. His mother was not sold, but she could afford him no protection. I determined to be free. My brother Charles was of like mind. How old I was then, I do not know, but from what the neighbors told me, I must have been about 17. Slaveholders are particular to keep the pedigree and age of favorite horses and dogs, but are quite indifferent about the age of their servants until they want to purchase. We made up our bundles, bade some of our friends farewell, and set out for Baltimore. We remained in Baltimore a week and then set out for Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, I engaged to work for Dr. Dingy. One day while I was working in the barnyard, a man came to the fence and, looking at me intently, went away. The doctor's son, observing him, said, Parker, that man must be a slaveholder or a kidnapper. We then looked down the road and saw him coming again. He rode up to the same place and halted. I then went to the fence and, looking him steadily in the eye, said, Am I your slave? He made no reply, but turned his horse and rode off. That same evening, word was brought that kidnappers were in the valley, and if we were not careful, they would hook some of us. This caused a great excitement among the colored people of the neighborhood. A short while prior to this, a number of us had formed an organization for mutual protection against slaveholders and kidnappers, and had resolved to prevent any of our brethren being taken back into slavery at the risk of our own lives. We collected together that evening and went down to the valley, where the kidnappers had gone. For so much alarmed were the tavern keepers by our demonstration that they refused to let them stop overnight with them. Kidnapping was so common that we were kept in constant fear. We would hear of slaveholders or kidnappers every 2 or 3 weeks. They did not hesitate to break open doors or to enter without ceremony the houses of colored men, and when refused admission or when a manly and determined spirit was shown, they would present pistols and strike and knock down men and women indiscriminately. There was no power to protect us nor prevent it. So completely roused were my feelings that I vowed to let no slaveholder take back a fugitive if I could but get my eye on him. The insolent and overbearing conduct of the Southerners when on such errands to Pennsylvania forced me to my course of action. Whether the kidnappers were clothed with legal authority or not, I did not care to inquire, as I never had faith in nor respect for the fugitive slave law. Not far away lived Moses Whitson, a well-known abolitionist and a member of the Society of Friends. Mr. Whitson had a colored girl living in his family who was pounced upon by the slaveholders. About daylight, 3 men went to Mr. Whitson's house and told him that the girl was their property and that they intended to have her. Friend Whitson asked the girl, if any of them was her master. She said, no. One of the slaveholders said he could prove that she was his property, and then they forcibly tied her, put her into a carriage, and started for Maryland. While the kidnappers were contending with Moses Whitson for the girl, Benjamin Whipper, a colored man, sounded the alarm that the kidnappers were at Whitson's. The news soon reached me, and with 6 or 7 others, I followed them. We proceeded with all speed to a place called Gap Hill, where we overtook them and took the girl away. Then we beat the kidnappers and let them go. We learned afterwards that they were all wounded badly, and that 2 of them had died in Lancaster, and the other did not get home for some time. On one occasion, kidnappers took a colored man and started for Maryland. 7 of us set out in pursuit, and soon getting on their track, followed them to a tavern in Chester County. Learning that they were to remain there for the night, I went to the door and asked for admittance. The landlord told us to be gone, or he would blow out our brains. We walked aside a little distance and consulted about what we should do. Our men seemed to dread the undertaking, but I told them we could overcome them, and that I would go in. One of them said he would follow at the risk of his life. The other 5 said we should all get killed, that we were men with families, that our wives and children needed our assistance, that they did not think we would be doing our families justice by risking our lives for one man. We, too, then went back to the tavern. I went to the yard, got a piece of scantling, took it to the door, and by battering with it a short time, opened it. As soon as the door flew open, a kidnapper shot at us, and the ball lodged in my ankle, bringing me to the ground. But I soon rose, and my comrade then firing on them, they took to their heels. My companion and I then rushed into the house. We unbound the man, took him out, but had hardly crossed the door sill before people from the neighboring houses began to fire on us. At this juncture, our other 5 men came up, and firing on both sides was kept up for 10 or 15 minutes when the whites called for quarter and offered to withdraw if we would stop firing. On this assurance, we started off with the man, reached home safely. The next day, my ankle was very painful. With a knife, I extracted the ball, but kept the wound a secret, as long before we had learned that for our own security, it was best not to let such things be generally known.